Before we start, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, can you please tell me from where and what time you're watching? Thanks.
Christmas Eve was never silent for me after that night. The first knock, soft yet deliberate, shattered the fragile stillness. Tap, tap, tap. My heart clenched as I peeked through the frost-lined window. There he was again, a figure in a red coat, motionless in the snow. His face was obscured, shadowed in a way that felt wrong, unnatural. I knew what he wanted. I knew who he was waiting for. But to understand why, I need to take you back to when it all began, the year I lost my little brother, Danny. I was 11 that Christmas. Danny was 5, small, full of boundless energy, and carrying a heart so big it could hold the whole world. For him, Christmas wasn't just a holiday, it was magic. He believed in it fiercely, like it could fix anything. One night, as the wind howled against our worn-down house, he whispered to me, "If I ask Santa, he'll make everything better. Mom won't cry anymore. Maybe Dad will come back." I remember staring at him, my throat tightening. What could I say? He was too young to understand that some wishes were impossible. So I nodded and lied. "Maybe you're right." That's how we ended up trudging through the biting cold to the mall. Danny wanted to see Santa, needed to, as if his happiness depended on it. By the time we reached the mall, the snow was already ankle-deep, and the place was almost deserted. Santa's stage was tucked near the food court, barely decorated and dimly lit. The Santa himself didn't exactly inspire joy. His suit was faded, his beard slightly yellowed, and his eyes, they weren't kind or twinkling, they were sharp, like he was sizing everyone up, calculating. But Danny didn't notice. He lit up like the Christmas tree in the center of the mall and ran straight to him. I followed but hung back, uneasy. "What do you want for Christmas, little one?" Santa's voice was low, gravelly, like boots crunching on ice. Danny, in his innocence, didn't ask for toys or games. "I want Mom to stop crying. I want Dad to come home. I want my sister to stop being mad at everything." Hearing him say that made my chest ache. I wanted to pull him away, to tell him this wasn't the kind of magic Santa could deliver. Santa listened, tilting his head like he understood. Then he leaned in close and whispered something to Danny, words I couldn't hear, words that made Danny's face light up with a mix of excitement and unease. When he climbed down, Santa looked at me. His smile was too wide, his gaze piercing. "Take care of your brother," he said in a tone that felt more like a warning than advice. We left the mall, snow swirling fiercely around us. Danny clutched a small, gift-wrapped box Santa had given him, refusing to let go. "What's in it?" I asked. "Santa said not to open it yet," he replied, hugging it like it was the answer to all his dreams. That night, the storm hit harder. Wind rattled the windows as Danny sat by his, staring out into the white abyss, the box still in his hands. "Santa's coming back," he whispered. I told him to go to bed, but he wouldn't budge. Exhausted, I eventually fell asleep, only to be jolted awake by 3 soft knocks at the door. Tap, tap, tap. Panic surged through me as I realized Danny's bed was empty. His window was wide open, snow covering the floor. I threw on my boots and coat and ran out into the storm, screaming his name. The wind tore at my voice, and the snow swallowed every sound. By morning, the storm had calmed, but there was no sign of Danny. The police searched, asked their questions, but all they found was the little box he had clung to so tightly, lying in the snow beneath his window. Inside was a snow globe. Its glass was foggy and cold, and inside was a perfect replica of our house, down to the crooked tree in the yard. When I shook it, snow swirled around, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw something move. A tiny figure in red walking between the trees. I threw it away, but it didn't matter. That night, as I lay in Danny's room, the knocks came again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, when I peeked through the curtain, I saw him, the figure in red. He stood motionless, staring at the house. His face was hidden, but I felt his eyes on me. The police didn't believe me when I called them. They said it was the stress, the grief, but I knew better. Every Christmas Eve since then, it's the same. 3 knocks, the figure in red. And Danny? He's still out there. I don't know where or how, but Santa? He's just waiting for the right moment to take me too. The storm that night wasn't just loud, it felt alive, like a beast prowling outside, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The wind howled through the cracks in our old house, and every creak of the floorboards made my skin crawl. I was 16, sitting by my bedroom window, watching the pine trees in the backyard twist and bow under the storm's fury. Somewhere below, my dad's heavy boots thudded across the floor. He'd been pacing for hours, muttering to himself about how storms like this stirred things up. I didn't know what he meant. Not then. Our town was small, tucked against the edge of an ancient forest. Nothing much ever happened here, or so I thought. But there was always one exception. Miss Eliza. She lived in a lonely cabin just beyond the tree line. To most people, she was a mystery, a healer to some, a witch to others. For me, she was just Miss Eliza, the strange woman who taught me how to read the snow. Snow remembers, she once told me, her voice calm but cryptic. It shows you where someone's been, where they're going. But it hides things too, when it wants to. At the time, I didn't understand her words, but they haunted me that night, especially after she vanished. The knock came just after dark. It was sharp, urgent, and made the storm outside feel like a distant whisper. My dad opened the door cautiously, gripping the latch like he was expecting bad news. Mr. Carroll, the owner of the general store, stood there, his face pale and tight against the cold. "It's Eliza," he blurted, his voice shaking. "She's gone." My dad's brow furrowed. "Gone? What do you mean?" She disappeared," Carroll stammered, glancing over his shoulder at the swirling storm. "Her chimney stopped smoking hours ago, so I went to check. Her cabin's empty and there's blood in the snow." That last part sent an icy jolt down my spine. Before I could stop myself, I was halfway down the stairs. My dad caught my eye and barked, "You stay here." But there was no way I was staying behind. By the time I pulled on my coat and boots, a group of men had gathered outside. The storm hit us full force as we trudged toward her cabin, the wind screaming in our ears and the snow swallowing our footsteps. Her home emerged from the storm like a shadow, dark and lifeless. The door swung open on its hinges, snow piling up inside. The cabin was chaos. Furniture lay shattered across the floor. A teacup was broken near the cold hearth, and the air was thick with a sense of wrongness. My dad called her name, but the silence that followed was deafening. Then, we saw them. 2 sets of footprints leading away from the cabin. One set was small, delicate, and unmistakably hers. The other was large, heavy, and wrong. The prints dragged between each step, as though something had been pulled. And then there was the blood. We followed the trail deep into the woods. The trees groaned under the weight of the storm, and every shadow felt alive, watching. The air grew heavier the further we went, like the forest itself was trying to keep us out. Finally, we found her. Miss Eliza was slumped against an ancient pine tree, half buried in snow. Her face was tilted toward the sky, her expression eerily serene, but the blood on her coat told a different story. My dad dropped to his knees, shaking her, calling her name. She didn't move. I couldn't bring myself to step closer. My flashlight flickered, its beam dancing across the snow, and that's when I saw it. Just beyond the tree, something crouched in the shadows. At first I thought it was an animal, a bear maybe, but its shape was all wrong. Its twisted body seemed too still, too unnatural, and then its eyes caught the light. They didn't glow like an animal's. They reflected back a cold, lifeless gleam that sent a chill straight to my core. It moved, a slow, deliberate shift that froze me in place. My breath caught in my throat, and before I could stop myself, I screamed. Whatever it was disappeared into the storm, its heavy, dragging footsteps fading into the wind. None of the men chased it. None of us dared. The coroner later claimed hypothermia had taken Eliza, that she'd wandered into the storm and collapsed. But the men who'd been there that night knew better. They'd seen the slashes on her coat, the strange tracks in the snow. None of them spoke about it, not openly. After her funeral, the town changed. People bolted their doors during storms. Parents warned their kids to stay close to home, but no one could forget what happened, and neither could I. Even now, I can't look at falling snow without hearing Miss Eliza's voice. Snow remembers, but it hides things too. Snow used to feel magical to me, a blanket of calm that made the world quieter, softer, almost dreamlike. But now, when I see it falling, I feel trapped, suffocated. Snow isn't magical anymore. It's a reminder of that night, the night I realized not all shadows are harmless. It was a Friday, and the news wouldn't shut up about the storm of the decade. Reporters were knee-deep in snow, warning everyone to stay home. But I didn't have a choice. I was stuck finishing inventory at the library. By the time I left, the streets were already buried, and the wind howled like a living thing. My apartment wasn't far, just a 15-minute walk, but as I trudged through the storm, the world felt eerily empty. The streets were silent, except for the crunch of my boots in the snow. The warm glow of streetlights made the snow look almost serene. For a moment, I thought I'd enjoy the walk. That's when I noticed him. At first, it was just a shadow, a figure moving through the swirling snow a few blocks behind me. Nothing unusual, I told myself. Probably just someone else braving the storm. But no matter how far I walked, the shadow stayed the same distance away, steady, unhurried. I turned onto another street, quickening my pace. When I glanced back, he was still there. My stomach tightened. I wasn't imagining it. Something about the way he moved, it wasn't casual, it was deliberate, like he was following me. I spotted the glowing sign of a small cafe up ahead and bolted for it. The bell above the door jingled as I stepped inside, the warmth hitting me like a blanket. A tired barista wiped the counter while a couple sat tucked away in a corner booth. I ordered tea, mostly to stall, and found a seat by the window, keeping an eye on the street. He was still out there. Now he stood across the street, half hidden in the shadows of an alley. He wasn't moving, but I could feel his gaze, even from here. My stomach churned. "Crazy night to be out, huh?" the barista said, breaking the silence. "Yeah," I forced a smile, "just trying to get home." I stayed longer than I needed to, sipping my tea and stealing glances outside. I hoped he'd disappear, but when I finally worked up the courage to leave, he was closer, leaning against a lamppost on my side of the street, like he'd been waiting for me. I didn't run, not yet, but my steps quickened, my boots crunching louder in the snow. I turned down a side street, hoping to lose him. The storm was picking up, the snow falling harder, blurring everything. The only sound was the crunch of my boots. And then his, behind me. Steady, unrelenting. My breath came out in sharp clouds as I turned a corner and spotted an apartment building. I climbed the steps, pretending I lived there, fumbling with my keys. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, just standing there, watching me. "What do you want?" I yelled, my voice cracking. He didn't answer, he didn't move. He just tilted his head, studying me like a predator sizing up its prey. That was it. I bolted down the other side of the building, the snow swallowing the sound of my frantic footsteps. My lungs burned and my legs ached, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare look back. Through the storm, I saw the glow of an open garage, a mechanic's shop. I stumbled inside, gasping for air. The workers stopped what they were doing, their faces filled with concern. "There's someone following me," I managed to say between breaths. "He's out there." They exchanged uneasy glances before stepping outside to check. I stayed behind, shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. After what felt like forever, they came back. "We didn't see anyone," one of them said. "Looks like he's gone." I wanted to believe them, I really did. They offered to let me stay, but I felt like I was imposing. My apartment was close. I convinced myself I could make it. Big mistake. The streets were empty again, and for a moment I thought it was over. Relief washed over me when I saw my building. I practically ran up the steps, fumbling with my keys. The second I was inside, I locked the door, feeling safe for the first time all night. Then I heard it, the faint creak of footsteps above me. My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen anyone else come in. Slowly, I looked up, and there he was, standing on the landing, staring down at me. His face was shadowed, but his presence was suffocating. I don't remember running to my apartment, but I must have. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and shoved a chair under the knob. My hands trembled as I called 911. The knock came next, soft at first, then louder, more frantic, and then silence. The splintering sound of wood snapped me back. He was breaking down the door. My heart felt like it would burst out of my chest. Just as the door gave way, flashing blue and red lights filled the room. The police burst in, tackling him to the ground. His screams mixed with the howling wind, a sound I'll never forget. That night changed everything. I used to love snow. Now it feels like a warning, because no matter how calm it seems, you never know what's hiding in the storm. They say curiosity killed the cat. For me, it was more like it almost got me killed, and maybe worse. But the thing is, I've always had this reckless curiosity, this itch to see what wasn't meant to be seen. And that's what led me to Frostburn House during the snowstorm of the century. The storm wasn't just snow, it was alive. The kind of wind that howls like it has a voice, rattling windows and shaking doors, begging to be let in. Streets were empty, the town buried under layers of white, but I couldn't sit still. Not when that house sat there, looming at the edge of town, calling me. It was the house we all grew up fearing. Frostburn House wasn't just creepy, it was evil. The kind of place that felt wrong even when you just walked past. They said people who entered never came back. They whispered about shadows that moved and voices in the walls. And when the snowstorm hit, my brain told me what any sane person would stay away, but my gut, it dared me. I dragged Jude, my cousin, along because I didn't want to go alone. He brought Lyra, his girlfriend, or sort of girlfriend. And then there was Theo, my best friend, who was already regretting every life choice that brought him here. The walk there felt like stepping into another world. Snow came down in sheets, erasing everything familiar. When we finally reached it, Frostburn House was worse than I remembered. The storm had almost swallowed it whole, icicles clinging to the roof like claws. The windows were black pits, the front door warped and splintered. It looked like the kind of place that breathed its own kind of cold. "I can't believe we're doing this," Theo muttered, shivering. I didn't answer. My gloved hand was already on the door, pulling it open. The air inside hit me like a wall. It wasn't just cold, it was wrong. The kind of cold that felt alive, like it was wrapping itself around you, trying to seep into your bones. Snow had crept through broken windows, leaving frost on the floorboards. The wallpaper peeled in long, jagged strips, and the air smelled like something left to rot. We split up to explore, but Theo stuck to me like glue. Jude and Lyra wandered to the back, their flashlights cutting through the dark. My light swept across a room that might have been a living room once. A rocking chair sat near the fireplace, creaking softly as if someone had just left it. Then, upstairs, things got different. The air grew sharper, colder. The hallway stretched out in a way that didn't feel natural. Every step groaned under our weight, and the shadows seemed to deepen. That's when we heard it, the first thud. "Did you hear that?" Lyra whispered, clutching Jude's arm. Another thud. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Theo froze beside me. We should leave, now. But I couldn't. My feet moved on their own, pulled by something I couldn't explain. The last door at the end of the hall seemed to call me. My flashlight flickered as I pushed it open. The room was freezing, and the frost wasn't just on the walls. It was alive, spiraling out from the far corner. That's where I saw her. She was crouched there, small and still, her knees hugged to her chest. A little girl, maybe. At least that's what I thought. Her tattered dress clung to her thin frame, and her head turned ever so slightly toward me. But when she looked up, my stomach dropped. She had no face, no eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin stretching over her skull. I stumbled back, the flashlight slipping from my hands. Its beam skittered across the floor, catching deep scratches in the wall. "Leave now, don't come back." Behind me, Theo shouted my name, Before I could move, the door slammed shut. The figure stood. Her movements were sharp, unnatural, like a puppet being yanked on strings. A voice, deep and guttural, echoed through the room. "You shouldn't have come." The others found me minutes later, bursting through the door. I bolted past them, gasping out, "There's someone in there!" But when we looked back, the room was empty. The frost was gone. The scratches, though, they were real. We didn't speak on the way home. The storm swallowed our footsteps, and the house seemed to watch us leave. Later, I learned the truth. Decades ago, during a blizzard, a family was trapped in Frostburn House. The youngest daughter, Abigail, disappeared. Some said she froze to death. Others whispered darker things. I don't know what happened to her, and I don't want to. I haven't been back since, but sometimes on stormy nights I hear the wind howl and it sounds like her voice. It started with the wind, a howling, relentless wail that clawed at the cabin like it wanted in. Snow swirled in chaotic spirals outside, piling up against the windows until the world looked like it had vanished in a blank haze. I was 18, home for winter break, and already feeling suffocated. College had given me a taste of freedom, and the cabin, a place I once loved, now felt like a cage. My mom had told me to stay inside. The storm was vicious, she said, dangerous, but I've always been stubborn. The air inside felt too heavy, too still. So I grabbed my boots, a flashlight, and my coat. I didn't tell anyone I was leaving. I just stepped out into the blizzard, craving the bite of cold air on my face and the strange allure of the woods. At first it was breathtaking. The snow blanketed everything, muting the world into a serene silence. My flashlight cut through the storm, catching the glitter of snowflakes as they fell. The path to the creek was familiar. I'd walked it 100 times as a kid. It would be a quick loop, I thought, in and out. But the storm had other plans. Within minutes, the snow thickened, erasing the path in front of me. The wind roared, whipping icy tendrils against my skin, stealing my breath. That's when I heard it. A bell. Not the cheerful jingle of sleigh bells or the soft chime of a distant church. This sound was deep, deliberate, and far too heavy. It rang once, echoing through the woods, cutting through the storm like a knife. I froze. At first I thought it was a trick of the wind, but then it came again, low and resonant, sending a shiver down my spine. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, the beam trembling in my shaking hand. The woods stretched out before me, an endless tangle of snow-covered trees. Nothing moved, and then the bell rang again. This time, it was closer. A knot of unease coiled in my stomach, but I couldn't help myself. Something about the sound tugged at me, pulling me forward, deeper into the woods. Each crunch of snow beneath my boots felt like a warning, but I kept going. I reached the clearing and nearly dropped my flashlight. The snow was stained red. A circle of animal carcasses, rabbits, a fox, even a deer, lay frozen and torn apart, their blood crystallized into dark patches on the icy ground. The smell was sharp, metallic and sickly, cutting through the frigid air. And then I saw them. Footprints. They were massive, deep imprints in the snow, leading away from the clearing and into the shadows. The bell rang again, louder, sharper, making my heart jolt. I whipped around and my flashlight caught movement. A tall figure slipping between the trees, barely visible through the storm. He was holding something. An iron bell. It swung slowly in his hand, the deep chime vibrating through the air. His coat billowed in the wind, and his face... I couldn't see his face under the hood. "Hey!" I called, my voice cracking. He didn't stop. He didn't even flinch. The bell rang again, and this time he started walking toward me. My pulse thundered in my ears as I stumbled back, the snow dragging at my boots. The bell's rhythm quickened, each ring louder and more frantic. I turned and ran. The snow was a trap sucking at my legs, slowing me down. Behind me, the bell kept ringing, relentless and closer. I dropped my flashlight in the chaos, but I didn't dare stop to pick it up. My breath burned in my lungs, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. Then I tripped. I hit the ground face first, the icy snow burning against my skin. When I scrambled up, I dared a glance back. He was there, closer now. His hood had slipped back, revealing a face that wasn't right. His skin was too pale, his features too angular, his eyes gleaming unnaturally in the darkness. And his smile, his teeth were too perfect, too sharp. Then I heard it, my dad's voice calling my name. "Here!" I screamed, desperate. I ran toward the sound, tripping and stumbling through the snow until I saw the beam of his flashlight. He grabbed me, his strong arms hauling me out of the storm. "He's out there!" I gasped. "The man with the bell!" My dad didn't ask questions. He held me tight, his own flashlight scanning the trees. For a moment I thought I heard it, the faint echo of the bell. But then we were moving, racing back to the cabin. My mom was at the door, frantic, tears streaming down her face. Inside, they bundled me in blankets and my dad grabbed his rifle. He went back out despite my protests. He didn't find anything. No footprints. No bell. Nothing. The police came the next day, but the storm had wiped the woods clean. They chalked it up to exhaustion or a prank. But they didn't see the flashlight I lost. It was propped upright in the snow, exactly where I dropped it, as if someone had placed it there. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there, but I'll never forget the sound of that bell. The snowstorm wasn't what chilled me to the bone that night. It was the look in her eyes, dark, hollow, and devoid of the warmth that had drawn me to her in the first place. By the time I realized something was wrong, it was too late. The storm outside wasn't the real danger, she was. It all began like a dream, a match on an app that turned into endless messages and voice notes. Her name was Mila, and she was perfect, or at least she seemed that way. Her laugh, soft and inviting, had a way of wrapping itself around you, making you forget the world. We talked about everything, our favorite books, places we wanted to travel, even the stupid jokes that only made sense in the moment. She was real, or so I thought. When she suggested we meet, the snowstorm brewing outside barely registered. She laughed when I hesitated. "Come on," she said. "It's just snow. I've got wine and heat. What more could you want?" I ignored the nagging voice in my head. I grabbed my coat and boots and headed out into the night, the snow whipping against my face. Her building wasn't far, an old brick complex that looked like it had seen better days. But when she buzzed me in, her voice was warm and cheerful, making the cracks in the walls and the dim lighting seem unimportant. Her apartment was cozy, almost too perfect. Candles flickered on every surface, filling the room with the scent of cinnamon and oranges. She greeted me barefoot, her cheeks flushed like she'd been sitting by a fire. She handed me a glass of wine before I even got my coat off. "Warm up," she said, her smile dazzling. We talked for hours. It was so easy, too easy. She told me about her family, her dreams, and the places she wanted to visit. I opened up more than I ever had before, feeling safe, feeling comfortable. The storm outside roared on, but inside, it was like another world. Warm, inviting, almost hypnotic. Then she refilled my glass. At first, I didn't notice anything. The room started to blur around the edges, and I thought maybe I'd had too much to drink. But it wasn't just the wine. My head felt heavy, and my limbs wouldn't respond. I tried to say something, but my tongue wouldn't cooperate. Mila leaned closer, her smile no longer warm but sharp, predatory. "Relax," she whispered. "Just let it happen." When I woke up, everything was different. I was on the cold, hard floor, my hands and feet tied with rough rope that bit into my skin. My face stung and every muscle in my body ached. The room was dark now, except for a single candle flickering on the table, its weak light casting twisted shadows on the walls. I tried to move, to cry out, but my mouth was gagged. Panic flooded me, sharp and cold as ice water. That's when I saw him. He stepped out of the shadows like he'd been waiting for me to wake up. Tall, broad shoulders, and wearing a ski mask that only revealed his eyes, cold, calculating, and merciless. He crouched beside me, his voice calm, too calm. "You're going to listen," he said, his tone dripping with quiet menace. "And you're going to do exactly what I say." I nodded, too terrified to do anything else. What followed was a nightmare I'll never fully escape. He took my phone, demanding my passcode. When I hesitated, he grabbed a fistful of my hair and yanked hard enough to bring tears to my eyes. The knife in his hand glinted in the candlelight, scratched and worn but sharp enough to make his point. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he hissed. I gave him the code. Helpless, I watched as he drained my bank accounts with a few swipes and taps, but he wasn't done. The worst came next. He pulled out a camera. I won't describe what he made me do, the positions he forced me into, or the cold, detached way he clicked photo after photo. Each flash of the camera was another reminder of how powerless I was. When he finished, he leaned in close, his breath hot against my face. "If you tell anyone," he said, his voice low and venomous, "these pictures go everywhere. Your family, your job, your friends, understand?" I nodded, tears streaming down my face as he packed up his things and disappeared into the night. Mila never came back. She didn't need to. It took me hours to free myself, the storm outside having calmed to an eerie stillness. By the time I stumbled out, the streets were empty, the snow crunching beneath my boots the only sound. For days I told no one. I barely ate, barely slept. When my friend Jake finally showed up, he found me sitting on the couch staring at nothing. He made me tell him everything. "Go to the police," he said. "Fight back." But how could I? Those pictures were a leash, a constant reminder that they still had power over me. Jake tried to convince me it wasn't my fault, that I was the victim, but the words didn't help. They still don't. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. And every time I see a flickering candle or hear the whisper of snow against my window, I think of Mila, her smile, her voice, and the trap I never saw coming. The night had an eerie stillness to it, the kind that made the hairs on your neck stand on end. Snow fell relentlessly, blanketing the world in an oppressive silence, and the wind howled like a distant scream. My little apartment, usually a cozy retreat, felt unnervingly isolated, as if the storm had pushed the world farther away than it had ever been. Living alone had its perks: peace, quiet, and no one to argue over dirty dishes. It was just me and Olive, my perpetually indifferent tabby cat. The plan for the night was simple: binge-watch my favorite show and savor a hot, cheesy pizza. The snowstorm outside only added to the appeal of staying in. I ordered the pizza through the app, selecting a driver named Ryan. His profile photo showed a guy with a warm smile, the kind of face you'd trust to deliver food in a storm without a second thought. The app promised he'd arrive in 30 minutes, so I settled in, watching Olive as she perched on the windowsill, her green eyes scanning the swirling snow like a sentinel. 30 minutes came and went, then 40. I wasn't too concerned. Snowstorms had a way of slowing everything down. Finally, my phone buzzed with the notification. "Ryan is approaching with your order." I muted the TV, listening for the familiar sounds of a car pulling up or boots crunching on the porch. Sure enough, I heard footsteps after a few moments. But then, nothing. No knock, no cheery "here's your pizza," just silence, save for the wind rattling the windows. Curious, I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. My stomach clenched. Ryan stood on the porch, clutching the pizza box. His hood was pulled low, obscuring most of his face. But he wasn't moving, just standing there, still as a statue, staring at the door. I hesitated, then typed a quick message in the app. "You can leave the pizza on the mat. Thanks." No response. He shifted slightly, leaning closer to the door, as though he were listening for something. My skin prickled with unease. A second later, my phone buzzed. "I need you to come out and take it. I can't leave until you do." My pulse quickened. Something about the message felt off. I typed back, "It's fine, just leave it there." His reply came instantly. "No, you need to open the door." Panic crept in. My hands trembled as I double-checked the locks. I glanced through the peephole again. He hadn't moved, but the way he stood there, rigid and unblinking, felt unnatural, like he wasn't really waiting for me to open the door, like he was waiting for something else. I tried one last message. "If you don't leave, I'm going to report this." His response froze the blood in my veins. "That's fine." Behind me, Olive let out a low, guttural hiss. My phone slipped from my hand, and I backed away from the door, my heart hammering in my chest. Grabbing my phone, I dialed 911, my voice shaking as I explained the situation. The dispatcher assured me help was on the way, but with the storm, who knew how long it would take? Then came the knock. Loud, deliberate. "Hey," a calm voice called out. "I just want to make sure you're okay. It's freezing out here." I didn't respond. My breath caught in my throat. Olive pressed against my leg, her fur bristling. Another knock, harder this time. "Come on," he said, his tone darker now. "Just open the door for a second." Seconds dragged into eternity as I stood frozen. Then finally I heard retreating footsteps. Slowly I crept to the peephole again. He was walking away, his figure vanishing into the storm. Relief surged through me so strong I nearly collapsed. But then I noticed something on the porch, a small black shape barely visible against the snow. It was a wallet. Trembling, I opened the door just enough to grab it before slamming it shut and locking it again. Inside the wallet there was no ID, no cash, just a single piece of paper folded neatly. I unfolded it with shaking hands. 4 words scrawled in jagged handwriting. "Next time, no locks." The police never found him, and every time it snows I can't help but check the porch, half expecting to see him standing there again. It's strange how certain people can walk into your life and change everything you think you know about the world and yourself. Smokey was one of those people. But the first time I saw him, I felt a chill that wasn't just from the storm outside. That night, the snowstorm was relentless, a furious blizzard pounding against the office windows. The wind howled like it was alive, its icy breath cutting through the cracks in the door. Then Smokey appeared. He stood framed in the doorway, stomping the slush from his boots, his coat and shoulders dusted with frost, like he'd just fought his way through the storm itself. "Rough out there," he said, his voice low and raspy, like he'd spent a lifetime speaking only when it mattered. It wasn't small talk. It felt more like a warning. Smokey wasn't your typical case. Most of the guys who walked into my office came armed with excuses, weaving stories to cast themselves as victims of circumstance. Not him. He didn't try to justify himself or plead for understanding. He just sat down, quiet and composed, his presence heavy with the kind of calm that comes from making peace with your own demons. His file was a thick one, brimming with ominous words like organized crime and murder. Yet when he spoke, his voice was steady, measured, as though he'd long ago decided not to waste words. For months, Smokey followed the routine, held down his job at a garage, stayed out of trouble, and never missed a meeting. He was as reliable as clockwork, almost boring. But there was something about him, a weight he carried, as if he'd walked through hell and come out scarred but still standing. Then, one snow-laden afternoon, Smokey lingered by the door after our usual session. His hands were buried deep in his coat pockets, and his expression was harder to read than usual. "You ever wonder how a guy ends up like me?" he asked, his voice nearly lost in the wail of the wind. I hesitated, unsure of what to say. "Yeah, I guess I do." He nodded, like he'd been expecting that. "All right, I'll tell you. But don't say I didn't warn you, it's not a pretty story." Smokey's story began on a night just like that one back in the late 80s. He'd been working for a narcotics ring that ran up and down the coast. What started as muscle work, leaning on people who owed money, evolved into something darker. He became trusted with jobs that came with heavier consequences. That night, his boss gave him an assignment he didn't want. A young recruit, barely old enough to shave, had gone missing for a day. The bosses thought he was a snitch. Smokey's orders were clear. Make sure he doesn't talk. Refusing wasn't an option. I knew it was a death sentence, for him, maybe for me too, Smokey said, his voice low, his eyes fixed on some distant point. But I went along with it. He told the kid, nicknamed Babyface, that there was a special job out in the woods. Babyface showed up smiling, eager, snowflakes clinging to his hair. Smokey drove him out of town, the car's headlights slicing through the storm. By the time they reached the woods, the snow was up to their knees. Smokey handed Babyface a shovel and told him to dig. It didn't take long for the kid to realize what was happening. The shovel slipped from his trembling hands, and he began to beg. His pleas tumbled out in desperate gasps. He said his mother was sick, that she'd die without him to take care of her. Smokey could have pulled the trigger then and there. It would have been clean, quick. But something about the kid's desperation clawed at him. "I told him to run," Smokey said, rubbing his hands together as if the memory left them cold. Told him not to stop until he was someplace no one knew his name. Babyface didn't hesitate. He bolted into the storm, disappearing into the swirling snow. Smokey stayed behind, standing in the icy wind with a gun in his hand, wondering if he'd just signed his own death warrant. A week later, Babyface's body turned up in a ditch. Smokey's boss was furious. They accused him of botching the job. To prove his loyalty, they sent him back out with 2 enforcers to dig up the grave and check for any evidence of a wiretap or tracking device. Smokey knew it was a setup, a test to see if he could be trusted. And he knew failing that test meant death. The storm that night was worse than before. The wind howled like a living thing, the snow biting at their faces like shards of glass. The enforcers dug for hours, their tempers fraying with each frozen shovelful. Smokey could feel the tension rising, the unspoken threat hanging heavy in the air. Then a shout pierced the storm. Flashlights cut through the darkness. Deputies. Someone had tipped them off. The enforcers opened fire, but the deputies were ready. In the chaos, Smokey caught a bullet in the leg. When the snow settled, the enforcers were dead, and Smokey managed to convince the deputies he'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. His boss wasn't so easily fooled. Smokey fled town, but it didn't take long for them to catch up. One of the enforcers tracked him down. Smokey didn't give him the chance to finish the job. The cops found Smokey soon after, that was it. 35 years behind bars, do I regret it? Smokey's voice was barely a whisper now, nearly drowned out by the wind outside. Maybe sparing that kid cost me everything, but I'd do it again. Somebody had to show him a little mercy. He stood, pulling his coat tight against the storm. Anyway, that's the story. Figured it was worth telling. Smokey finished his parole a few months later. I never saw him again, but on nights when the wind howls and the snow piles high against the windows, I think about him. He always said he wasn't a good man, but maybe, just for that one moment, he was the best man he could be. When I first moved to the city, it felt like stepping into a strange, hollow place where shadows stretched a little too long, and every corner seemed to whisper secrets meant for someone else. I didn't belong. The streets were endless mazes, the air sharp enough to cut, and the people. They were always in a rush, as if fleeing from something I couldn't see. Then, one freezing evening, as snow twisted through the crooked alleyways like ghostly fingers, I found it. A bar at the end of a narrow lane, its wooden sign barely visible under a thick layer of frost. A warm golden glow spilled out from its windows, bathing the icy cobblestones in an inviting light. It wasn't just a bar. It felt like a sanctuary. The moment I stepped inside, I was swallowed by its warmth. The heavy oak beams above, the worn leather stools, and the fireplace crackling softly at one end gave it a timeless quality, as if it had been untouched by the outside world. The air smelled faintly of whiskey and pine, like a memory you'd want to revisit again and again. That bar became my anchor, a place where I didn't feel like a ghost drifting through the city, and that's where I met Theo. Theo was the kind of guy you couldn't ignore even if you tried. His laugh was thunderous, filling the room and breaking through the thickest silences. He talked with his hands, his stories painting pictures in the air. We clicked immediately, and soon Theo became the reason I started looking forward to my nights at the bar. But the bar had its own ghosts. One of them was Eric. Eric was an old-timer, always seated in the same dark corner. He never spoke unless spoken to, and watched everything with a cold, heavy gaze that could chill your blood. He had been coming to the bar long before people like Theo or me. Though he never said it outright, you could feel his disdain for the changes, the laughter, the life that Theo brought. One night during a brutal blizzard, the kind where snow claws at the windows and the city feels utterly abandoned, things took a turn I'll never forget. The bar was lively despite the storm. Theo and I sat near the fire talking about nothing in particular. Eric, as usual, was in his corner brooding. The tension between him and Theo was almost palpable that night. Theo, always the peacemaker, even tried to buy Eric a drink, but Eric refused, muttering something under his breath. Theo laughed it off, but I saw the flicker of unease in his eyes. As the snow piled up outside, Theo excused himself to use the restroom. The door swung shut behind him, and I stayed by the fire, letting the warmth seep into my bones. Minutes passed. then more. 15 minutes later, he still hadn't come back. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I got up, making my way toward the back hallway. The bathroom door was ajar, creaking softly in the draft. "Theo!" I called, my voice barely cutting through the muffled howl of the wind outside. That's when I saw him. Theo was slumped against the wall, his shirt dark with blood that spread in a crimson stain across the floor. For a moment, the world froze. My legs buckled, and I dropped to my knees beside him, pressing my hands against the gaping wound below his ribs. "Theo, hang on," I whispered, my voice cracking with panic. His eyes fluttered open, and even through the pain, he managed a faint, lopsided smile. "Guess Eric didn't like my snow joke," he rasped, his voice strained but carrying that familiar humor. Then I saw it. The knife on the floor, its blade glinting under the dim light, slick with Theo's blood. The back door was wide open, snow swirling in like a ghostly veil. Eric was gone. The next moments were a blur. Someone called an ambulance. The storm was relentless, and the city had practically shut down. By the time help arrived, Theo was barely holding on. I watched the paramedics carry him into the blizzard, their red and blue lights disappearing into the storm. Hours later, I learned the news. Theo didn't make it. The snow had slowed the ambulance just enough to steal his last chance. The bar was never the same. The warmth it once held seemed to vanish. Eric's car was found days later, buried under snow on the outskirts of the city. He hadn't made it through the storm either. Theo's funeral was a quiet, somber gathering. His laugh no longer echoed through the bar, and his favorite stool by the fire remained empty, a ghostly reminder of what we'd lost. I still go there sometimes, though it feels different now. I keep a sketch of Theo tucked in my coat pocket, drawn by a friend before that night. It's my way of holding on to the light he brought to a place that now feels colder than ever. The storm has long passed, but its shadow lingers, etched into the walls of the bar and carved deep into my memory. You ever get that feeling deep in your gut, that warning that says this is a bad idea, but you do it anyway? That was me the day the snowstorm hit. You see, I'd been warned about northern winters, how brutal they could get. But this storm, it wasn't just cold. It was a biting, suffocating freeze, the kind that cuts through you no matter how many layers you wear. The city seemed eerily quiet, like the snow had swallowed every sound, even the usual hum of life. It felt wrong, too still, too quiet. Something was off. It was my first day at Northridge Logistics, the huge company everyone in town whispered about. My fiancé, Evan, had tried to talk me out of going. He handed me a thermos of coffee saying, "Just start tomorrow. No job is worth braving this mess." But I couldn't. This wasn't just any job. This was the job, the one that would get us out of the hole we'd been stuck in for so long. I bundled up, caught the last bus still running, and made my way to the massive concrete fortress of a building. It looked less like an office and more like a bunker. When I entered the lobby, I was met with the buzz of new hires brushing snow off their coats, eager for a fresh start. But then, there was him, Ryan. He stood off to the side, his coat wide open against the freezing cold, eyes darting around the room, scanning everyone like he was cataloging every detail. His name tag read Ryan, and while the others chatted and laughed nervously, he just stood there like a shadow. He cracked a joke during orientation, but it landed flat, the silence in the room swallowing it up. Still, something about him felt off. Not loud, not obvious, just off. The kind of off that creeps up on you when you're too distracted to notice. When they split us into groups for a tour of the building, Ryan ended up in mine. Power had been knocked out in parts of the building by the storm, leaving some hallways dim, lit only by the flickering emergency lights. Creepy enough, but Ryan seemed almost too interested in the darkness, his eyes flicking to the corners like he was looking for something or someone. At one point, he leaned in close, his breath cold against my ear, and whispered, "Kind of eerie, isn't it? A place like this. It'd be so easy to disappear." I laughed it off, but my heart wasn't in it, and I made sure to stick close to the trainer after that. By the end of the day, the storm had only gotten worse. The wind howled outside like it was alive, trying to tear the world apart. As I headed for the exit, I didn't see him at first. But then Ryan appeared next to me, like he'd been waiting. "You got a ride?" he asked casually, as if we were old friends. Evan was already outside, heater blasting in the car, so I just nodded. "Yeah, I'm good, thanks." He nodded back, but there was something unsettling about how long he lingered, watching me like he was memorizing every little detail. It made my skin crawl. That night, the snow piled up against my windows and my phone buzzed. Unknown number. It was Ryan. At first, the messages were harmless enough, talking about the storm, sending memes to break the ice. But then he sent a photo of the building, buried in snow, saying he'd stayed late to explore. My heart skipped. I didn't sleep well that night. The storm raged on into the morning. During our first break, I stepped outside to clear my head to breathe in the sharp, icy air. The smoking area was blanketed in fresh snow. Finally, I thought I'd have a moment to myself. But no, Ryan showed up like he'd been waiting for me. "Mind if I join?" he asked, not waiting for an answer before sitting far too close. He grabbed my lighter without asking, flicking it nervously. "Check this out," he said, showing me a picture of himself, shirtless, from his Marine days. I mumbled something polite, but I couldn't get away fast enough. He grabbed my arm then, not hard, but enough to make my pulse spike. "Relax," he said, smiling like it was a joke, but there was nothing friendly about it. Over the next few days, it got worse. He would hover while I worked, step into my space like he didn't understand boundaries. He made weird comments that sounded like compliments, but weren't. "You should smile more." He left creepy drawings of things that felt too personal. The worst one, a drawing of a woman who looked exactly like me, her eyes wide, filled with terror. He left it in my locker. That was the breaking point. One night, as I grabbed my coat to leave, he cornered me in a hallway. The lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows, and the storm outside made the whole place feel isolated, like we were the last two people in the world. He leaned in close, his breath icy. "You don't have to be so uptight. We could have fun." I don't know where I found the courage, but I snapped. "Leave me alone, Ryan." He just laughed, that same unsettling smile playing on his lips. "You'll miss me when I'm gone." The next morning I reported him to HR. It was a long, drawn-out process. Weeks of paperwork, meetings, and silence from him as he found new ways to make my life hell. He cornered me in the break room, whispered things that made my stomach churn. Then, one day he grabbed my wrist again, forcing a smile. "You should smile more." When they finally fired him, I felt relief. But it didn't last long. A week later, I started getting friend requests from fake accounts, usernames too similar to be random. Even after the snow melted and spring came, the chill from that storm never really left me. Every time the first snowflakes of the season start to fall, I think about Ryan, about how easy it is for someone to hide behind a quiet demeanor, how easy it is to become someone else in the dark. Honestly, I hope I never see him again, or another storm like that, ever.